Hey guys, have you ever seen an anime that seems determined to defy all logic? One that leaves you scratching your head over just about every creative decision made? Today I want to talk about quite possibly the most nonsensical anime I've ever come across. The series is called Weiss Kreuz, which apparently means white cross in German. And I apologize for my pronunciation. My German is a little rusty here, guys. I'm not sure why they went with this title, given the fact that the entire series takes place in Japan and there are no ties to Germany whatsoever, but that's Weiss Kreuz for you. I first watched this series years ago, and I got into it because I thought it was an action show about assassins, which it kind of is, so I guess I got what I wanted. Maybe this is one of those monkey's paw, be careful what you wish for type of situations. But enough stalling. Let's get into it. Today we'll be covering the characters and the first season of the show, and I should warn you, there will be spoilers. So the premise of the show is that there are 4 guys who run a flower shop by day and are assassins by night. That's it, that's the whole premise. I guess the point is that the show is supposed to function kind of like a harem anime. You know, the kind where there's a main character surrounded by a bunch of ostensibly attractive side characters, all of whom are madly in love with the lead. But unlike most harem anime, there's no central protagonist in Weiss for the men to fawn over. Instead, I guess we're just supposed to watch the harem as it exists in the wild, in its natural habitat. Anyway, the title, Weiss Kreuz, is also the name of the assassin group that the characters belong to. And I'm just going to refer to it as Weiss from here on out, because that's what the characters in the show do. And speaking of the characters, let's get to know them. Alright guys, buckle in because this is where the logic really starts going out the window. There are 4 main characters in Weiss, each with their own unique backstory and fighting style. Let's check them out. We'll start with Omi, who is quite possibly the most nonsensical character in the bunch. Omi is the youngest member of the group and has a very sunny and caring personality, so I guess you could call him the heart of the team, or possibly the jailbait. I mean, I know that Shota is a thing, but I wish I didn't. Anyway, since he's only 17, Omi is still a high school student. So I guess he goes to school by day and then also works at the flower shop on top of his assassin's duties by night? I'm trying to figure out when this kid sleeps. Maybe he has one of those time turners from Harry Potter? It doesn't help either that his supposed co-workers are constantly ditching him to do all the legwork during missions.
その中から怪しげなところをリストアップするってのがどんなに大変なことか。
ま、それをやるのがお前のお仕事。ただし1週間でね。
少しは手伝おうって気持ちはないの？
俺たちは実行派だもんな。プランの検討はオミの役目だろ。
じゃ、そいつの手当てをさっさと済ませて、例のヘリの行方を追ってくれ。
また僕？それで幼児くんたちは？
寝るに決まってんだろ。睡眠不足でドロドロになった顔を女の子に見せるわけにはいかねえんだ。
僕はドロドロでもいいっていうの？ちょっと幼児くん、あやくん。
俺もドロドロはごめんだ。
As I mentioned before, each character has their own unique weapon. Omi's is a crossbow. That's right, apparently the members of Weiss use only the finest in medieval weaponry. I'm guessing the logic here is that since the series is geared toward a teenage audience, the series creators didn't want the main characters to be running around waving guns all over the place. So their solution, in Omi's case, was to give him a crossbow, which is a much more gruesome and messy weapon than a gun. Oh, but don't worry folks, there's no blood, so it's okay. We find out fairly early on in the series that Omi is actually suffering from amnesia. As it turns out, he was kidnapped as a kid, but his father refused to pay his ransom. Omi eventually managed to escape his captors, and I guess the idea is that the trauma from the incident caused him to block out the memories. But the whole amnesia thing really just raises all kinds of questions about how Omi has been living up until now. We know that he has no idea who his parents are. He doesn't even remember his real name, which is Mamoru. But up until the episode where we learn about his kidnapping, he never behaves as though he has any issues with his memory. In fact, he's not even aware of his own amnesia until his memories start coming back. So my question is, how exactly has Omi been surviving this whole time? Remember, he's just a teenager, so who's been paying his school tuition? Who's been feeding him? And why in the 10 or so years since his kidnapping has he never questioned who and where his parents are? And for that matter, since he doesn't even remember the kidnapping, why did he join Weiss in the first place? The series goes out of its way to let us know that Omi hates killing, so it's not like he became an assassin just for kicks. Things actually become even more nonsensical when Omi begins to reconnect with his family, but we'll get a little more into that when we talk about the plot. Okay, on to character number 2. Allow me to introduce you to Yoji, one of the most insufferable anime characters of all time. He's basically every skirt-chasing pervert you've ever seen in an anime, but actualized much more poorly. Every time Yoji opens his mouth, he's talking about some girl that he's cheating on or how much he wants to get with pretty much any woman he sees. Hilariously, though, Yoji often positions himself as some sort of champion of women. He volunteers himself on pretty much any mission that involves female victims and becomes infuriated when he sees violence against women. And all of this on its own would be fine, but when you start to look into the way Yoji treats women throughout the series, the whole champion of women idea starts to seem pretty rich. In one episode, the group finds out about a club where a bunch of women and young girls are essentially being trafficked. Yoji volunteers to take the place down, and in the next scene we get a comedic, quote-unquote, sequence of him undercover at the club. We get a small scene where he wakes up next to a couple of girls, implying that there was a three-way the night before, and you can tell by the framing that this is meant to be an "Oh Samantha" moment. Or an "Oh Yoji" moment, I guess. Like, there goes Yoji again, couldn't keep it in his pants, isn't that funny? But we just learned in the previous scene that all of these girls at the club are essentially slaves who've been forced into sex work. Some of them from childhood. Yoji knows this, and yet decides to have some fun taking advantage of the situation at the club before bringing it down. It's actually more gross than funny to watch, especially when you get to the end of the episode and see him acting all sanctimonious toward the owners of the club, as if he's any better than them at this point. But wait, there's more! In another episode, the group comes across a 15-year-old girl who's had a kidney stolen. Another member of the group ends up working closely with her to find the people who did it, and all throughout the episode, Yoji will not shut the fuck up about how sexy he finds this literal child.
いいなあ、弾ける肉体。スポーツにかける青春か。
あれ、幼児は女子高生は嫌いじゃなかったのか？
相手次第、相手次第。
Gross. And in yet another episode, Yoji refuses to save a woman's life until Omi tells him that she's pretty.
ヨウジ君、この先の洞窟に女の人をかくまってるんだ。薬で眠らせてある。車で東京まで連れて帰ってほしいんだけど。
しかし、
綺麗な人なんだ。
わかった。
So, hear that, ladies? Your life only has value if Yoji wants to give you his gross infected D. And if you're a guy, I guess you're just screwed altogether. Yoji's backstory is that he used to be a private eye. One day he and his partner caught wind of a club called Liot where women were being trafficked as sex workers, the very same club that Yoji later visits undercover. While the pair were investigating the club, his partner was killed by a group of criminals. Presumably, Yoji chose to join Weiss in order to avenge her death, but the series never explicitly makes this clear. He just used to be a private eye, and now he's an assassin. Of all the characters in the show, it would make the most sense for him to use a gun, since we see him carrying one in a flashback sequence, and he obviously knew how to use it. But the series isn't concerned with making sense, so instead he uses a Garrett wire. And you might be thinking, well, a Garrett wire is a perfectly normal tool for an assassin to use, but there's nothing at all normal about how Yoji uses his. Basically, it functions pretty much like Indiana Jones's whip. Anything Yoji wants it to do, it'll do. We see him using it as a noose, we see him using it to restrain enemies. I'm pretty sure the only thing we don't see it used for is, a Garrett wire. I could break down the whole episode where we learn about Yoji's past, but honestly, I've already gone over pretty much everything of interest in that episode. I guess the only other fact of note is that the episode begins with Yoji flashing back to his partner's death. Then, during his investigation in the club, he ends up meeting a trafficking victim who reminds him of his dead partner. The two work together to bring the club down, but then at the last moment she ends up dying in pretty much the same way Yoji's partner did, at the hands of the same people. In both situations, the woman dies because Yoji ends up injured and urges her to flee. You might think that one of them would care enough about him to refuse, but both women take the first opportunity to ditch his ass and end up dead as shit because of it. So basically, the beginning of the episode mirrors the end, and since they both shake out the same way, we're left knowing that Yoji has apparently learned nothing at all. Weiss does end up killing the bad guys and bringing the club down, though, so that should be Yoji's story finished, right? Like, now that he's avenged both women he lost, he doesn't really have much reason to keep on with his role as an assassin, does he? Well, no, I guess I'm wrong, because he just sort of hangs around with the group for the rest of the series, being the literal worst. Anyway, let's move on to Aya. Of all the characters in the show, Aya probably makes the most sense, at least in terms of his backstory. His deal is that his parents were killed by a crime boss. His younger sister was nearly killed as well, but managed to survive and is now in a coma. Somehow, I don't think we're ever told how, Aya found out the name of the crime boss and joined Weiss hoping to avenge his family. So, a pretty simple and straightforward motivation. Unfortunately, Aya's entire personality is just revenge, so as the series goes on, he becomes pretty boring and one-note. The only other aspect of his character that we get to see is a disturbing sense of sexual tension between him and his comatose sister. Basically, Aya's sister is his one consuming obsession. He's constantly visiting her in the hospital and giving her flowers, which would be fine on its own, but things start to get a bit weird when he takes her name. His real name, as we learn at the end of the first season, is Ron. Aya is actually his sister's name, but after her hospitalization, he took it on, I guess, to keep her memory alive, even though she's not dead. There's also an episode where Aya encounters a girl that looks almost identical to his sister. We're literally never given an explanation as to why the two look so similar, but because of the resemblance, Aya becomes determined to protect her. And all throughout the episode, the creators do everything they can to sexualize this 15-year-old girl while Aya just stares on at her. It gets pretty uncomfortable pretty quickly, especially because the series also implies that she is into him. The whole thing just feels weird and gross. In terms of Aya's weapon, it is quite possibly one of the dumbest in the group. Omi's crossbow is at least a ranged weapon, so you can conceivably see him going toe-to-toe against someone with a gun. And Yoji's magical Garrett wire can do basically anything, so you can see why he'd use it. As for Aya, he chooses to fight with a katana. And why a katana specifically? Does he have any special skills or background with swords that would make this make sense? No, of course not. One minute he's a completely normal high school student, and the next he's an ultra-powerful sword master with the ability to dodge bullets. I think the only person with a dumber weapon than Aya has to be Ken. Ken is my favorite character in Weiss, and I think that's probably because he has the least amount of screen time. That means he has less time than the others to be a slimy perv like Yoji or a boring revenge freak like Aya. But don't worry, he still manages to offend all notions of common sense. Ken's backstory is that he used to be a pro soccer player, or football player if you're nasty, but after being involved in a scandal, he ended up losing everything. And I hardly know where to start with all this. First of all, the scandal he was involved in had to do with some kind of illegal gambling ring. The series makes it very clear that Ken was innocent and was set up by one of his friends and fellow athletes. So if that's the case, you would think there would be an investigation by the police and that Ken's name would be cleared, right? But no. What happens instead is that the police are apparently never involved, and Ken ends up being booted from his team based on, I guess, an accusation alone. Well, not entirely alone. As it turns out, that same friend who set him up also gave Ken a drugged drink during his last game. So on top of the gambling shenanigans, Ken was also caught up in a doping scandal. And I think the idea is that he joined Weiss in order to find out the truth about the gambling ring. But just like with Yoji and Omi, this is never explicitly stated. We're just sort of left to assume that he made the jump from pro soccer player to assassin. And I guess the logic here was that he was innocent of involvement with a gambling racket, so now he's going to clear his name through murder? Like, how does turning to the life of an assassin improve Ken's situation here at all? I'd also like to know whose bright idea it was to make a public figure an assassin. When Ken was recruited, he was a pro athlete, which means that both the gambling racket and the doping incident were very public scandals. His face was all over the news. I would think that being famous would be a pretty undesirable trait for an assassin, but what do I know? But wait, things get worse. We have to talk about Ken's weapon. He uses these bladed brass knuckle things to claw his enemies to death, and I barely know where to start with these things. First of all, can you imagine a less practical weapon for an assassin to use? Anyone with a gun should be able to take him down with ease, and the only reason they don't is because he's covered in plot armor. But even so, why choose a weapon that's going to pretty much guarantee you end up completely soaked in your target's blood? Isn't that something an assassin would want to avoid? Remember, too, that Ken's sport of choice is soccer. You know, the one game where you can't use your hands. So why give him a weapon that he can exclusively use with his hands? How does any of his past skills transfer to killing people with claws? You would think that the creators of the series would have made him a boxer or maybe a martial artist. You know, somebody who's used to using their body as a weapon and who has experience specifically attacking with their hands. But no, I guess that would make too much sense. Anyway, fairly early on in the series, Ken runs into a former friend. Remember the one who sabotaged his whole career earlier? At first, Ken is unaware of the betrayal, but throughout the space of a couple of episodes, he learns the truth about what happened and manages to get his revenge. This basically wraps up his entire storyline, but much like Yoji, Ken just sort of keeps hanging around without much reason to be there. And the last character I want to touch on just briefly is Persia. Persia is the one who gives Weiss their missions. Every time he has a new job for them, he contacts them by video call, and the group is able to hear his voice, but they never see his face. So it's basically a Charlie from Charlie's Angels situation. Every time he gives them a mission, Persia uses the same sign-off phrase, which is, "Hunters of the night, deny these dark beasts their tomorrows." And I gotta say, I haven't heard a line that spine-tingling good since Steven Seagal threatened to snatch every birthday.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. 'Cause now, I will snatch every motherfucking birthday.
Anyway, the reason I bring Persia up is that he was also the one who formed Weiss, so presumably he recruited each of its members personally. And when you really think about it, none of his recruiting decisions make that much sense. Beginning with Omi, we learn fairly early on in the series that after his kidnapping, he was rescued by Persia himself. But we also learn that Omi never saw Persia's face. Even in the present, when Omi tries to find answers about his family and where he comes from, he's unable to contact Persia for answers because he doesn't know Persia's true identity. So basically, this guy rescued Omi, and then what? He obviously didn't raise him, so who did? Did Omi just grow up without any kind of family, never questioning why his friends at school had parents when he didn't? The series also makes it pretty clear that Omi has been working for Persia for some time, and he's only 17 years old when the series begins. So I guess Persia rescued him just to turn him into some kind of child soldier for his own private assassin group. What a stand-up guy. And it's a similar situation with Aya, too. We learned pretty late in the series that Aya was just a normal high school student when his family was killed. So again, I guess Persia just recruited this literal child into Weiss. And you might think, okay, well at least this answers some questions. Like, if Persia recruited all 4 members of Weiss, he must have been the one who taught them how to use their weapons, right? Well, no. Just like Omi, none of the other characters have any idea who Persia is, and with one possible exception, none of them have seen his face. So he couldn't have been the one to train them. I guess we're just left to assume that Persia recruited the 4 guys and then left them to figure out how to be assassins on their own. There's a bit more to say about Persia and his connection to the members of Weiss, but in order to get into that, we need to get into the show's plot. Weiss is much more of a character-driven show than a plot-driven show, so the first 7 or so episodes just kind of meander around, giving us backstories on the main characters. It isn't until episode 8 or so that the plot sort of starts showing up. At this point, it becomes clear that pretty much every crime in Tokyo can be traced back to one crime family, the Takatoris. And don't worry if you forget that name, because Aya repeats it about 50 times per episode. As it turns out, this family is the one responsible for his parents' death. They also have ties to the club that Yoji took down and to the people that framed Ken, but both of these plots have been resolved by now. So, hilariously enough, the series just plugs on, disregarding the fact that half of our main cast has no reason to be there. Things really start kicking off in episode 10. The members of Weiss become aware of an underground criminal ring that allows the ultra-rich and powerful to hunt human beings. Our protagonists head out to investigate, and after some shenanigans, Omi manages to track down the leader of the hunting racket. He is, of course, a member of the Takatori family, and in a twist that's honestly telegraphed a mile away, we learn that Omi is this guy's brother. That means that the father who refused to pay Omi's ransom was the leader of the crime family, Reiji Takatori. Again, Omi apparently forgot all of this during his amnesia, but when his memories start coming back, he ends up having a crisis of conscience about killing his own family members. This causes some dramatic tension between Omi and Aya because I guess Aya hates all Takatoris on principle. Again, the plot just sort of meanders around while Omi tries to figure out whether his allegiance should lie with Weiss or with his family. During this meandering, a romance starts to blossom between him and one of the regulars at the flower shop named Oka. Over the course of a few episodes, the characters end up falling in love, just in time to discover that Oka is also Reiji Takatori's child, making Omi and Oka brother and sister. And, okay, spoiler alert, at the end of the first season we learned that Reiji Takatori is not actually Omi's father. Instead, Persia ends up being his real dad, and also the brother of Reiji Takatori. So don't worry folks, they're not actually siblings. They're just literal kissin' cousins, I guess. Anyway, some enemies of Weiss end up attacking Oka, and she dies in kind of a gross scene where she and Omi get all emotional and romantic. And I just want to point out for the record that this is now our second sort of romance with a sort of sister in this show. Anyway, Omi ends up getting over his moral dilemma about his family because all of them are acting like cartoon villains, which I guess technically they are. But just when Omi is coming to terms with his role in Weiss, Aya suddenly decides that Persia's been holding out on him and heads out to find Reiji Takatori on his own, effectively quitting the team. While all this is happening, Takatori and his crime family are making moves to have Takatori voted Prime Minister of Japan. In the season finale, the antagonist's plan comes to fruition and he ends up winning an election and being voted in. So in the last couple of episodes, we see Omi, Ken, and Yoji essentially taking on the whole Japanese defense force in order to get to him, while Aya kind of messes around on his own. So I guess at this point they're not so much assassins as superheroes, given that they single-handedly take down an entire military. And the season concludes with Aya deciding that he does want to be a member of Weiss, and the team finally defeating Takatori together. We get a final shot of Weiss standing amid the flaming ruins of Takatori's empire, and roll credits. So, final thoughts on the show. Well, I've definitely seen anime a lot more confusing than this one, but Weiss has its own particular brand of nonsense that makes it stand out from the crowd. So much of this series is spent on characterization and backstory that the plot is almost non-existent. And despite all of the time that's given to fleshing out these characters, there are still major gaps in their histories that raise a lot more questions than they answer. And I think that's because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Weiss is basically meant to function as a harem anime. The point of the show isn't to have an airtight plot or to make you think. It's meant to present you with 4 pretty boys to drool over. So if, like me, you're not really into the whole harem anime thing, this show really isn't going to have much for you. But that's just my opinion. As always, I'd like to know what you guys think. Have you seen Weiss? Did you like it? Or were you as flummoxed as I was by the series? I'd love to know in the comments. Until then, see you next time.